Simone chose the worst moment to laugh. Standing beside Vernon Caldwell's coffin, she whispered that his grand will would probably leave Isaiah nothing but unpaid bills, a cracked house, and another reason to feel ashamed. Mourners heard her. Isaiah did too. He said nothing, as attorney Adelaide Monroe opened a sealed envelope marked for immediate reading. Simone kept smiling until Adelaide announced that Vernon had never been poor. He controlled a fortune, 3 companies, and an estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then came the sentence that erased Simone's confidence completely. Every asset, every voting share, and every property belonged to Isaiah alone. The funeral had been held in a small chapel on the edge of Atlanta, chosen because Vernon had insisted on something quiet and unremarkable, without limousines or flower arrangements meant to impress strangers. Isaiah stood near the casket, in a gray suit that felt too heavy for the humid morning, trying to hold himself together while guilt gnawed at the edges of his composure. He had not visited his father as often as he should have during those final months, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone he could not put down. Simone had always found a reason to keep him away: a work dinner, a client emergency, a trip that could not be rescheduled, and Isaiah had let her reasons become his own, until the visit stopped altogether. When Simone finally arrived 20 minutes late, she wore black that looked more expensive than anything else in the room, and her first words were not for her husband, but for the size of the chapel, which she called embarrassing for a family. With their image to protect, she did not touch Isaiah's arm or offer him comfort. Instead, she leaned toward a cousin standing nearby and murmured that she only hoped Vernon had not left behind a mountain of debt disguised as an inheritance. A few heads turned. Isaiah heard every word, and something in his jaw tightened, but he refused to turn his father's funeral into a public argument. So he swallowed the insult and let it settle beside all the others he had swallowed over the years. Isaiah remembered his father as a man who spoke little, but noticed everything, who had raised him alone. After Isaiah's mother passed away, when he was still a boy, working long hours at what Isaiah always assumed was an unremarkable job in logistics management, Vernon never complained about money. He had taught Isaiah to fix a leaking faucet, to balance a checkbook, to shake a man's hand like he meant it, and to never mistake quiet for weakness. Looking down at the casket now, Isaiah wished he had asked his father more questions while there was still time to hear the answers. Throughout the service, Simone's phone kept lighting up in her lap, with messages from a contact saved only as B. E. And each time Isaiah glanced over, she flipped the screen face down with practice speed. When the service ended and Adelaide asked several people to remain in the chapel's reception room for the reading of the will, Simone tried to leave, insisting there was no reason to sit through paperwork on a day already so exhausting. Adelaide's voice did not rise, but it carried enough weight to stop her at the door, informing her plainly that whatever Vernon had left behind would affect her marriage directly, whether she chose to hear it now or later. Simone sat down again, arms crossed, the same thin smile still fixed on her face, as if she already knew there was nothing worth her attention. Adelaide confirmed that the will had been signed in front of 3 independent witnesses and reviewed legally every 6 months for the final 3 years of Vernon's life. A detail meant to close off any future argument about his mental state. She broke the seal on the envelope and began reading aloud, her voice steady and unhurried, the voice of someone who had read difficult documents to difficult families many times before. I, Vernon Augustus Caldwell, being of sound mind, she read, declare Isaiah Caldwell to be the sole heir to all assets under my ownership, without division, without condition, and without exception. Simone's smile did not survive the sentence. Her eyes moved slowly from Adelaide's face to the folder resting on the table between them, and for the first time that day, she looked genuinely afraid. Adelaide set a thick binder on the table, its cover printed with a single line that made the room go. Still estimated estate value $487 million. Simone stared at the number, as though it might rearrange itself into something smaller, if she looked long enough, and then she turned toward the husband she had mocked less than an hour earlier. her expression shifting from disbelief into something closer to calculation. Adelaide continued reading through the schedule of assets, with the same clinical calm she had used for the opening line, and the list grew longer with every sentence. There was Caldwell Meridian Holdings itself, the parent company Vernon had built and hidden behind decades of careful anonymity. There were 3 commercial buildings in downtown Atlanta, a 190-acre industrial property on the city's outskirts, and an investment portfolio worth $64 million, spread across conservative and long-term positions. There was a 73% voting stake in Ellington Urban Group, a company Isaiah had never once heard his father mention. There was the modest house Vernon had lived in for over 30 years, along with everything inside it and a cash reserve of $38 million sitting untouched in trust accounts. Finally, there were partial ownership rights to several logistics and transportation patents Vernon had quietly funded through smaller subsidiaries over the years. Isaiah felt the room tilt slightly beneath him. He had always believed his father was a retired accountant, living on a modest pension and a handful of cautious investments. A man who drove the same car for over 20 years, not out of principle, but out of necessity. Vernon had never worn anything that looked new, never mentioned success, and had firmly refused every offer Isaiah made to help repair the aging house, insisting the roof still had years left in it. Adelaide explained that Vernon had built his empire over decades using layered holding companies and appointed representatives specifically to keep his name out of business journals and public records, a decision he made after watching wealth destroy people he had once trusted. She told the room that Vernon had started with a single delivery route in his 20s, reinvesting every dollar he earned rather than spending it, and that by the time Isaiah was in high school, his father already controlled more than anyone in the family could have imagined. Vernon had watched over the decades as sudden wealth turned old friends, bitter split families apart, and drew predators toward anyone who let their fortune become public knowledge. He decided early on that his son would never be raised as the heir to anything but simply as a boy who understood the value of honest work, and he had guarded that decision fiercely for nearly 40 years. Simone reached for Isaiah's hand the moment the number settled in the room, and the coldness that had defined her voice at the chapel dissolved into something soft and rehearsed. "Sweetheart," she said, "your father always saw something special in you, didn't he?" Isaiah pulled his hand back slowly, unable to reconcile the woman speaking now with the one who had laughed beside a coffin less than an hour before. Adelaide, watching the exchange without comment, went on to explain that the estate had been placed inside a private trust structure, meaning it would not automatically become shared marital property, and it could not be transferred, gifted, or leveraged by anyone else. While Isaiah spent the coming weeks deciding how he wanted to proceed, she added that Isaiah would gain immediate control over the voting shares tied to the estate, but any transaction above a certain threshold during the first 30 days would require her co-signature as temporary administrator, a safeguard. Vernon had written into the trust himself. Simone's face tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of restrictions, though she recovered quickly enough to mask it with another soft smile aimed at Isaiah. As they left the chapel, she wrapped her arms around him in front of the remaining guests, telling anyone within earshot that they needed to go home together and grieve as a family, her voice pitched perfectly for an audience. But in the parking lot, while Isaiah unlocked the car, he caught a glimpse of her phone screen as a message went out to the same contact from earlier 3 words that would follow him into every conversation that came after everything has changed. That night, back in the quiet of their home, Simone became a version of herself. Isaiah barely recognized cooking dinner. She normally left to a service, talking about resigning from her position to support him through this transition, and suggesting a trip somewhere private so they could, in her words, reconnect as a couple. Isaiah watched the performance without interrupting it, cataloging the distance between this woman and the one who had spent years finding small ways to remind him his father's world was beneath her. She had once refused to invite Vernon to their anniversary dinner because his car in the valet line would draw the wrong kind of attention from her colleagues. She had called his father's house a museum of failure during an argument Isaiah had never quite forgiven her for. she had urged him only weeks earlier, to sell the property the moment Vernon passed, calling it dead weight neither of them needed to carry. Later that evening, while Simone showered, Isaiah quietly reviewed the shared phone billing account he still had legal access to, and found a pattern of calls placed to a divorce attorney's office, stretching back nearly a month. He did not break into her personal devices or read anything he had no right to see. Instead, he documented what he legally could access and forwarded copies to his own attorney the following morning, wanting a clear record before anyone could claim the timeline had been altered. He sat with that discovery alone for a long while, replaying the last several months in his mind, and realizing how many small moments now made a different kind of sense. The late nights explained away too easily the sudden interest in a father's finances, the way she had always steered conversations about the future toward practical matters rather than shared dreams. It was not anger that settled over him first, but a slow, quiet grief for a version of his marriage he now understood had likely never existed the way he believed it did. When he mentioned nothing of this to Simone, she seemed to relax, mistaking his silence for forgiveness rather than patience. Adelaide met with Isaiah privately at the Caldwell Meridian offices 2 days later, and she did not seem surprised when he described what he had found. Vernon, she told him, had suspected for years that Simone's affection for his son had limits tied closely to comfort and appearance, though he had refused to interfere, directly believing Isaiah needed to see the truth for himself rather than be told it by someone else. She handed him a handwritten letter Vernon had left with her months earlier, sealed and dated to be opened only if the will was contested or if Isaiah began asking questions about his marriage. In it, Vernon apologized for keeping his wealth hidden, but explained his reasoning plainly. A person can pretend to love a son when they believe he has money, but Vernon needed to know who would stay when they believed he had nothing at all. The letter made no demand that Isaiah leave his marriage or punish anyone for what they had done. It simply asked him not to sign anything while grief still had its hands around his judgment. That same week, Simone proposed opening a joint investment account, meant, she said, to protect their future, and produced paperwork, granting her financial power of attorney, under the justification that Isaiah was too overwhelmed by loss to handle these decisions alone. He declined to sign, calmly and without explanation, and watched her composure crack for just a moment before she smoothed it back into concern, insisting she only wanted to help carry the weight he was under. That night, an email arrived in Isaiah's inbox from an address Vernon had set up before his death, encrypted and forwarded automatically through a schedule only Adelaide had access to. The message contained a single line: "When Simone asks you to sign anything, tell Adelaide to open the file marked Cypress." Adelaide brought Isaiah down to the secured records floor of Caldwell Meridian Holdings the following afternoon, unlocking a private vault that held documents Vernon had compiled under the code name Cypress. Inside were bank statements tracing payments through a series of shell vendors, consulting contracts bearing Simone's signature, and printed email exchanges between her and a man named Bryce Ellington, the chief executive of the very company Isaiah had just inherited a controlling stake in. The record showed $8,400,000 siphoned out of Ellington Urban Group over roughly 2 years, routed through invoices for services that were never rendered, then funneled into a shell entity controlled by someone close to Bryce. Caldwell Meridian, as it turned out, had quietly held the controlling interest in Ellington Urban Group for years, though Simone had never known the majority owner was anything more than a distant, disinterested investment fund. Nolan Whitaker, the company's chief financial officer and one of Vernon's most trusted employees, explained that Vernon had discovered irregularities while reviewing expense reports months earlier and had hired a forensic accounting team to quietly build a case before deciding what to do with what he found. He had not gone public with the evidence yet, still unsure whether Simone was an unwilling participant caught in Bryce's orbit or an active partner in the scheme. The emails answered that question without ambiguity. Simone had not merely gone along with the fraud. She had proposed some of its methods herself, suggesting fake advertising campaigns as cover for the payments and adjusting invoice language to avoid triggering internal audits. In one message, she wrote plainly that once she left Isaiah, they would no longer need to pretend, and in a reply, Bryce told her to make sure the old man didn't leave his husband anything that could cause problems for either of them. Nolan pulled up a timeline on a small monitor, showing exactly when each fraudulent payment had gone out, and cross-referencing it against dates when Simone and Bryce had traveled together under the pretense of separate business trips. The pattern was unmistakable once laid out in sequence. Each withdrawal followed within days by a matching deposit into accounts neither of them believed anyone would ever trace back to them. Adelaide noted that Vernon had specifically instructed his forensic team to preserve every version of the documents, rather than simply the most damaging ones, wanting the full picture available in case anyone later claimed the evidence had been selectively chosen to make Simone look worse than she truly was. Isaiah felt the betrayal settle deeper than the theft itself. The woman who had laughed beside his father's coffin had also spent years secretly helping steal from a company that, unknown to her, belonged to that same father. Adelaide advised him against confronting Simone, immediately warning that if she and Bryce realized the Cyprus file had surfaced, they might destroy remaining evidence or move the stolen funds somewhere harder to trace. Isaiah agreed to keep playing the part of the grieving, unsuspecting husband, while the investigation continued quietly behind the scenes. Simone, meanwhile, arranged a candlelit dinner that week, announcing her intention to resign from her position so she and Isaiah could run his father's empire together. She asked pointed questions about whether he had received passwords, shareholder records, or the authority to call a Bexianan urban group, and Isaiah answered honestly that Adelaide still retained oversight for the first 30 days. Simone smiled at his answer, though her grip on her wineglass tightened just enough for him to notice. After Isaiah left the room that night, Simone called Bryce and told him in a voice sharpened by urgency that they no longer had 30 days to work with and that the will needed to be invalidated before Isaiah gained full control of the company. Bryce introduced Simone to an estate litigation attorney within days, and together they built a case around 3 claims that Vernon had lacked mental capacity when he signed the will that Adelaide had exerted improper influence to secure, in control of the estate for herself, and that Isaiah had known about his father's wealth all along, deliberately isolating him from Simone to keep the inheritance for himself. Simone filed a motion asking the court to freeze the estate, framing herself publicly as a devoted wife trying to protect her grieving husband from manipulation by people who did not have his best interests at heart. The litigation attorney Bryce introduced her to specialized in contested estates involving self-made fortunes, and he warned Simone early on that judges tended to favor documented intent over emotional testimony, advising her to gather anything that might suggest Vernon had wavered on his decision before he died. Simone spent hours combing through old voicemails and text exchanges, searching for anything usable, growing increasingly frustrated as every message only confirmed how distant her relationship with Vernon had actually been. In public, she played the role convincingly, telling reporters that Isaiah was overwhelmed and being taken advantage of by his father's legal team. At home, she pressured him to join her lawsuit against Adelaide, arguing that together they could control the estate without any outside oversight standing in their way. Isaiah asked her directly whether she wanted to protect him or control what his father had left behind, and she avoided the question entirely, dissolving into tears and insisting Adelaide was the one destroying their marriage. He said nothing about the Cyprus file, choosing instead to tell her only that he intended to let the court determine the will's validity on its own. Bryce, growing anxious, began pressuring board members at Ellington Urban Group to sign an early extension of his contract before Isaiah could exercise his newly inherited voting power. Nolan warned Isaiah that Bryce was trying to lock in 5 more years of control before anyone could stop him. Isaiah used his shareholder authority to block the vote without revealing his reasons, a move that told Bryce, in no uncertain terms, that this supposedly naive heir understood far more than either of them had assumed. Days later, Simone announced she had located an old audio recording in which Vernon supposedly said he wanted to leave something behind for his daughter-in-law. She used the clip to argue publicly that Vernon had once promised her a share of the estate, but when Adelaide reviewed the recording, she recognized immediately that it had been edited. The full, unaltered version told a different story entirely. Vernon's actual words were that he wanted to leave his daughter-in-law a chance to tell the truth before her own greed destroyed everything around her. Adelaide then revealed something Simone had not anticipated. 11 days before his death, Vernon had recorded a final video statement addressed directly and by name to Simone, stating clearly that he already knew exactly what she had been doing. At the formal hearing to determine the will's legitimacy, Simone arrived dressed modestly carefully, constructing the image of a heartbroken widow's daughter-in-law, fighting for fairness rather than fortune. She testified that Vernon frequently forgot names, confused locations, and had once told her he intended to divide the estate evenly between her and Isaiah. Adelaide's legal team responded, methodically presenting neurological evaluations, confirming Vernon's full mental competency. Recordings of board meetings. He had personally chaired 3 independent capacity assessments. Documentation showing the will had been reaffirmed multiple times over several years, and recordings of Vernon explaining each provision in his own words and with total clarity. Simone continued insisting she and Vernon shared a close relationship, describing regular visits and long conversations that painted her as a caring, attentive family member. Adelaide countered with visitor logs from Vernon's home, showing that over the final 18 months of his life, Simone had appeared exactly twice each visit, lasting less than 20 minutes. One of those 2 visits, the records showed, had been specifically to urge Vernon to sell his house and hand the proceeds over to Isaiah. Simone's attorney attempted one final maneuver, suggesting that Vernon had grown paranoid and distrustful in his final year, prone to sudden suspicions about people close to him that had no basis in reality. Adelaide calmly introduced a stack of correspondence between Vernon and 3 separate business partners, each letter demonstrating sharp, coherent reasoning about contract terms, market conditions, and long-term strategy. Right up until the final weeks of his life, she reminded the court that competency was not measured by warmth or sentimentality, but by clarity of thought, and Vernon's clarity had never once wavered, not in his boardrooms, and not in the quiet hours he spent writing letters meant only for his son to read someday. Cornered by the evidence, Simone refused to withdraw her claim, instead accusing Isaiah of poisoning his father's opinion of her long before Vernon's death. It was at this point that Adelaide requested permission to play Vernon's final recorded statement for the court. In the video, Vernon sat upright, stated the date clearly, and answered a series of standard cognitive assessment questions without hesitation, eliminating any doubt about his mental state. He explained in his own steady voice that he had chosen to leave everything to Isaiah because his son was the only person in his life who had never once asked him for money. Vernon's recorded voice continued calm, but unmistakably deliberate. "Simone doesn't know I'm wealthy," he said, "and that ignorance gave me the chance to watch how she treats a man she believes has nothing to offer her." The courtroom fell into a silence that felt heavier than any argument that had come before it. Simone turned toward Isaiah, searching his face for any flicker of doubt or sympathy. But he did not look back at her. The recording was not finished. Vernon looked directly into the camera one final time and added a line that changed the direction of everything that followed. "If Simone is contesting this will," he said, "Adelaide has my permission to reveal the real reason she is afraid of Isaiah gaining control of Ellington Urban Group." Adelaide chose not to disclose the full criminal file inside the open courtroom, since the investigation remained active and premature exposure. He could compromise it, but she submitted sealed documentation directly to the presiding judge for 4.Q. Private review. The judge examined bank records, forged vendor contracts, and internal communications during a brief recess, and upon returning, denied Simone's motion to freeze the estate entirely. The will was declared fully valid, with no further grounds for contest. Outside the courthouse, Simone turned on Isaiah, immediately accusing him publicly of choosing money over his marriage. He answered her without raising his voice, telling her plainly that she had chosen money long before he ever knew he had any to choose between. It was in that moment Simone understood with sudden and total clarity that Isaiah had already known about her and Bryce for some time. She tried to shift the narrative, insisting Bryce had manipulated her, and that every transaction had been carried out under his direction rather than her own. Isaiah asked her calmly why she had scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney weeks before his father had even passed away. She had no answer for that, and for the first time since the funeral, her composure did not return. At Ellington Urban Group, Bryce quietly ordered the technology department to wipe several older servers, unaware that Vernon had established an independent backup system months earlier as a precaution. Nolan retrieved the complete untouched data and delivered it to the forensic accounting team, closing off any possibility that the evidence could conveniently disappear. Isaiah chose not to expose the affair to the press, believing that infidelity was a private matter between him and Simone, while the theft was a matter for evidence and the law to resolve properly. Using his newly inherited 73% voting stake, Isaiah called an emergency board meeting at Ellington Urban Group. Simone received the notice and mistakenly assumed Isaiah intended to give her a chance to explain herself, arriving in a sharply tailored suit with a prepared speech about rebuilding the company together. Bryce reassured her that no board would risk removing a sitting chief executive during an active crisis, certain that instability alone would protect him. When they walked into the boardroom, Isaiah was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by Adelaide Nolan, the forensic accounting lead, and corporate counsel. In front of every board member sat a printed copy of the Cypress file. Isaiah opened the meeting with a single sentence that silenced the room before either Simone or Bryce could speak. "Today is not about the wife who betrayed me," he said. "It is the day shareholders remove two people who stole $8,400,000 from this company." Nolan walked the board through the flow of funds, displaying 6 vendor entities that had no employees, no offices, and no legitimate services to their names. Several of the fraudulent invoices carried Simone's direct approval signature, while Bryce had personally signed off confirming services that had never actually been performed. Bryce insisted the entire file had been fabricated by Vernon to seize control of the company, but Adelaide presented findings from 2 independent auditing firms, alongside the untouched server data Nolan had preserved, leaving no room for the claim to survive. One board member asked whether outside regulators had already been notified, and Adelaide confirmed that preliminary reports had gone out weeks earlier, meaning the matter was no longer something the company could quietly bury, even if it wanted to. Bryce's face lost its color at the mention of regulators, and for the first time since the meeting began, he stopped arguing and simply listened. Simone attempted to redirect blame entirely onto Bryce, claiming she had merely signed what she was instructed to sign by her superior. A projected email undermined that defense, immediately showing Simone herself proposing inflated contract pricing and suggesting the two of them split the resulting difference. Bryce turned on her in front of the entire board, furious that she had kept written evidence of their arrangement, and the two of them began openly attacking each other rather than defending themselves. Isaiah waited until the outburst subsided before speaking again. He introduced 3 formal resolutions to the board: the immediate suspension of Bryce Ellington as chief executive, the termination of Simone's employment on the grounds of fraud and conflict of interest, and the transfer of all supporting documentation to law enforcement and the company's insurance carriers. The board approved every resolution by an overwhelming majority. Several board members asked pointed questions about how long the fraud had continued undetected and why internal controls had failed to catch it sooner, and Nolan answered each one directly, explaining that Bryce had personally overridden 2 separate compliance flags during the period in question, using his authority as chief executive to classify the transactions as routine marketing expenditures. One older board member, a woman who had sat on the company's founding committee decades earlier, remarked quietly that she had always found Bryce's confidence a little too smooth to be trusted completely, and that she regretted not pushing harder on her instincts years before. The room grew tense as more numbers appeared on the screen, each figure a reminder of how methodically the scheme had been constructed and how easily it might have continued indefinitely, had Vernon never noticed the pattern in his own quiet review of the books. Bryce argued loudly that Isaiah lacked the experience necessary to lead a company of this size, and Isaiah responded that he had no intention of running everything alone. He planned to retain capable executives already in place, bring in independent outside experts, and rebuild the oversight systems Bryce had spent years quietly dismantling for his own benefit. It was a measured, deliberate answer that made clear Isaiah's judgment had not been clouded by the sudden weight of his inheritance. Simone caught Isaiah in the hallway afterward, telling him that even though she had lost her position, she remained his wife and retained a legal right to half of everything he now owned. Adelaide reminded her that the inherited estate sat inside a protected trust structure, entirely separate from marital property, and that the fraud findings would likely affect any financial claims she attempted to raise during divorce proceedings as well. Isaiah handed her a sealed envelope without another word. Inside was a divorce petition, along with a copy of the very attorney consultation she had scheduled weeks before his father's funeral, the same appointment she had believed no one would ever discover. Simone stared at Isaiah's signature at the bottom of the page and asked quietly how long he had been planning this. He answered simply that it had not been nearly as long as she had been planning hers. Several days later, Isaiah returned alone to his father's house, a place that felt even now more valuable to him than every property and portfolio he had just inherited. In Vernon's study, he found a series of notebooks filled with careful records of his son's life newspaper clippings about projects Isaiah had worked on years earlier, and letters Isaiah had written home during college that his projects father had kept and reread more times than the worn creases suggested. It became clear, sitting there among the evidence of a quiet, private pride, that Vernon had simply never known how to say any of it out loud. Simone appeared at the door that afternoon, without the car service, the assistant, or the polished wardrobe she once relied on. She said she wanted to apologize before it became too late for either of them to say anything meaningful at all. She admitted that she had loved him once, but that over time, her fear of being seen as beneath her own ambitions had reshaped who she became, and that Vernon's modest way of living had embarrassed her in ways she was only now willing to nama alout. She spoke about growing up in a household where money determined whether people were treated with dignity or dismissed entirely, and how that early lesson had calcified into something she no longer knew how to set down even when it cost her. The one relationship that had never actually asked anything of her. For a moment, Isaiah felt the old pull of sympathy, the instinct to comfort her the way he always had. But he recognized it now for what it was, a habit built over years rather than a reason to stay. He told her gently that understanding where a wound came from did not excuse the damage it caused to other people, and that Vernon had deserved better, regardless of what shaped her into someone capable of dismissing him so easily. She told him that if she had known Vernon was wealthy, she never would have treated him the way she did, and it was that single sentence that revealed to Isaiah exactly how little had actually changed inside her. He asked her plainly whether his father would have deserved her contempt if he truly had been poor, and Simone had no answer for that question either. She asked him to withdraw the divorce and offered to testify against Bryce in exchange, but Isaiah told her the truth was something she owed to honesty itself, not a bargaining chip to trade for a marriage that no longer existed. He returned her personal belongings and the jewelry that had always been hers, not as an act of punishment, but simply because there was no reason left to hold on to any of it. Before she left, Isaiah opened his father's final letter, one he had saved to read only when he was ready. In it, Vernon had written that Isaiah did not need to become cold in order to prove he was strong, and urged him to remain fair, but never again open the door to someone who had only learned to love him after discovering what waited behind it. She lingered by the door for a moment, as though waiting for him to say something that might soften the finality of it all, but Isaiah simply held the door open and let the silence answer for him. Simone cried on her way out, but Isaiah did not follow her to the car this time. After she disappeared down the driveway, he removed his wedding ring and placed it beside the last photograph he had of his father, understanding for the first time that the end of this marriage was not a failure at all, but the exact moment he stopped betraying himself. Months passed, and Bryce was formally indicted on charges tied to fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of the ongoing investigation. Simone reached a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, though she still faced civil liability and was required to return a significant portion of the funds she had received through the scheme. The divorce was finalized quietly, and because Vernon's estate had been structured through an irrevocable trust, Simone received nothing from it at all. Isaiah refused every request for a celebratory interview and declined to turn the story into a public spectacle at his ex-wife's expense, believing there was no dignity in humiliating someone publicly for choices they would have to live with privately for the rest of their life. At Caldwell Meridian Holdings, he appointed Nolan as interim chief executive, established an independent audit committee, strengthened protections for internal whistleblowers, and terminated every contract that carried even a hint of the corruption Bryce had cultivated for years. He spent long evenings reading through his father's old files, learning the names of employees who had been with the company since its earliest days, and made a point of meeting each of them personally, rather than issuing directives. From behind a closed office door, word spread slowly through the company that the new owner listened more than he spoke. A trait several longtime employees said reminded them unmistakably of Vernon himself. Isaiah declined a larger office on the top floor, choosing instead to keep his father's modest corner space exactly as it had been, with the same worn desk and the same framed photograph of a delivery truck from decades earlier. He often told colleagues that the company's foundation had been built on patience and consistency rather than spectacle, and he intended to run it the same way his father always had, even if the numbers involved were larger than either of them had ever imagined discussing openly. A portion of the company's profits was redirected to establish the Vernon Caldwell Trade Fellowship, a program built to train adults seeking new careers and provide them with the kind of steady opportunity Vernon himself had once believed mattered more than any headline or public recognition. Isaiah kept his father's house exactly as it was, repairing the roof, repainting the walls, and restoring the old car Vernon had driven for decades, without ever turning the property into something it was never meant to be. At the fellowship's launch, Adelaide handed Isaiah the original handwritten version of the will, explaining that Vernon had not chosen his heir based on blood alone. He had chosen someone capable of holding real power without ever using it to humiliate another person. Isaiah spoke briefly to the employees gathered that day, telling them his father had lived like a man with nothing, simply to learn who would treat him with respect when there was nothing obvious to gain from doing so, and that he refused to let that lesson turn him into someone who distrusted everyone around him. Instead, he intended to judge people by what they actually did. The fellowship's first class of trainees included a former warehouse worker who had lost his job during a company closure, a single mother rebuilding her career after years away from the workforce, and a young veteran struggling to translate his logistics experience into civilian opportunity. Each of them chosen, not for their credentials, but for the same quiet determination Vernon had once valued above everything else. Isaiah sat in the back row during their first orientation session, listening rather than speaking, and found himself thinking that his father would have approved of exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous beginning. After the ceremony ended, Isaiah drove alone to the cemetery and knelt beside his father's grave, setting the fellowship's first quarterly report down in the grass beside the headstone. He told Vernon that Ellington Urban Group had stabilized, that the stolen money was slowly being recovered, and that the old house would never be sold. Before he stood to leave, he thought again of Simone's laughter beside the coffin, a sound that had felt in that terrible moment, like the final insult delivered to a dying man's memory. Now he understood it differently. That laughter had not been an insult at all. It had simply been the moment her true character finally had nowhere left to hide. Isaiah rested his hand against the cold stone and spoke quietly. The words meant only for the man buried beneath it. "You didn't leave me a fortune," he said. "You left me the truth." He walked back toward Vernon's old car, the keys to an empire worth hundreds of millions resting in his pocket. And for the first time in his life, he no longer measured his own worth by what other people believed he owned. Simone had laughed because she believed Vernon died with nothing. She never understood that his final gift was revealing exactly who had nothing inside.